All right, people, welcome back. It's another Sunday, another recap for House of the Dragon. We are almost done with this season, episode 6, entitled Faceless Men, not to be confused with the Faceless Men of Bravos from the original run of Game of Thrones. I'm here once again with Eli and Luke. Unfortunately, could not make it again tonight. He had some family business, but we are joined once again by longtime longtime Talking TV alumni, I guess you could say. I'm not sure quite where to classify you, but you hopped on for the Odyssey and you're hopping back on for House of the Dragon. You and me did, this is again a return to form of sorts, since you and me recap every single episode of Game of Thrones, the original Game of Thrones show, during COVID. So I feel like there was nobody better to fill Luke's shoes than the one and only Professor Pat Huber. How are you, man? Good to have you back on.
I'm doing pretty good, and I guess I would have to say the Game of Thrones universe. I can't quit you.
You literally can't. You're in an abusive relationship with it. You literally, as soon as you start to step away, something else, some more alluring dragons draw you in. So, Pat, as far as House of the Dragon goes, we have not had you on to talk about the show since and Eli, you were on for this episode as well, way back in 2022, when we recapped pretty much the entirety of when we covered the premiere, I should say, of the first season of House of the Dragon. Needless to say, the show has changed a lot, quite significantly, since that. They lost a showrunner in the form of Miguel Sapochnik. George R.R. Martin famously disowned the show after season 2. So just before we get into the nitty-gritty of this episode, just give us your general thoughts on the show overall and kind of how it's evolved from when it first started.
Well, I think all the behind-the-scenes stuff that's happened over the course of the series, it really doesn't impact my enjoyment of the show. I'm not too much into the weeds in terms of looking at the behind the scenes, and I didn't read this book, so again, I'm a blank slate. So I think I look at any adaptation in the way of, this is a brand new medium, it has brand new rules or different rules, and we're going to see a interpretation of what the original source material is. And I'm so far glad and happy to be here in the third season, and I'm enjoying the story that they're telling.
It's interesting because I feel like kind of a common thread between myself, Eli here, and Luke, kind of a little bit of our wherewithal with the show has been not necessarily the deviation because of the way in which the source material was originally written and is adapted. The source material famously being an unreliable narration is told to us by a septet fool and is written more as a historical text to be interpreted rather than a straight narrative of fiction, the way in which the original Game of Thrones show was. So it's interesting you heard to say that, especially, as the only non-book reader here, Eli's read the book, Luke has read the book. I basically did a Wikipedia summary ingestion, if you will, in multiple sittings of the book, so I have a general idea of what happened and what's coming. So this is going to be an interesting discussion, to say the least, especially given that I feel like with certain things that they have adapted / interpreted, again, it's one of those things where they can kind of get away with not necessarily adapting it exactly, since they can basically go off the fact, the showrunner and these writers can basically go off the fact that, not everything necessarily happened the way that you may have thought in the book, so we can kind of play around with that as such. But Eli, I think it's safe to say that we have been, how should I put this, a little bit perturbed by the pacing of the show up until this point.
Yeah, I can say that. I think that's pretty fair. I think there are some periods of time that have been stretched out a little longer than others. Is the show bad? No, I still like the show. Even at its maybe worst moments, I still rate it much higher than just your average TV show. It's phenomenal storytelling, phenomenal writing, at least at the high points. But I think I feel like the story is just a little too big to be able to handle. And I still give everyone working on the show credit for everything that they're doing. It's a bloated story. It's an incredibly bloated story. And I think, we talked about it last week. There are some points where there are some plot lines that maybe are getting a little too much time compared to some others. But overall, the plot is still progressing each episode, each week, even if it is slower than at least how it may seem in the books. I'm all for the little moments. I think when we were talking about just the start of the show, anytime I'm really on here, we're talking about adaptations, I always like to see like recontextualization, especially with this being like a historical text, basically. Being able to see some backroom conversations that our writers in the book have never been able to see. So being able to see the characters actually interacting versus just the story being told of their actions is still really interesting. And I've been pleasantly surprised with a lot of moments that have happened so far.
So we were pretty critical of last week's episode. I think understandably so, since that was kind of a little bit of a real slowdown episode after, I would say, two understandably so, but already kind of slow-paced episodes with episodes 3 and 4, given that the first two episodes, again, it's a little bit of a trick with knowing the behind the scenes, knowing kind of the truncation that happened between seasons 2 and 3, the fact that the writer's strike basically forced them to stall the last two episodes of season 2 and basically tacked them on to the beginning of season 3, which has caused the season to have this weird kind of elongated beginning / setup for the end game, where the first two episodes feel like it's concluding everything from the last season, and then episodes 3 and 4 feel like the real start, which I feel like is kind of why last week's episode felt so weirdly placed and paced, if you will, because it's a third episode that's placed as the halfway point. So it's a character-focused episode that's primarily only focused on one side. It was heavily focused on the green side, but to a point where it felt like all of that was kind of like, okay, we're focusing on a lot of things that are either being told to us that we already know or just setting us up for character deaths that we wish would have happened already. And one of the highlights of this episode, I will say, is the fact that for all of the drudgery that we had to sit through last week with them just setting up for Butcher's Ball and Cole and Gwaine just marching through just endless amounts of bog and dealing with untold amounts of traps, only for Cole to tell Gwaine once again that he wanted to die, something that he had pretty much already told him at the end of season 2. It makes me wonder again if that sequence that we got with them at the end of season 2 was just tacked on to the ending, because they're like, oh shit, this scene that we had set for this season, or that was only supposed to happen in this season, we need something in order to cue that up. So with that being said, we kick off with Butcher's Ball, or rather I should say the shortened version of it, because Butcher's Ball, I mean, Eli, you read the book. Was Butcher's Ball this short in the book? I feel like this took up all like 2 minutes, and I feel like there's almost like a self-awareness going into this as far as like, okay, look, we all hate Cole. We know you guys hate Cole. We've already spent what little time we spent with him this season torturing him enough. Let's just get this over with as fast as humanly possible. And he dies in, I would say, pretty much the same way that he died in the book, in the most pathetic, shortened way possible. His men get instantly butchered by the fake out that the Rivermen have left for them. They're all but eviscerated. There's like 9 guys left, and they're surrounded by an army almost unfairly. Oscar Tully and Roderick Dustin come out. Cole tries to challenge them, and immediately Black Alley shoots him full of arrows, and he doesn't even get a chance before the rest of his men are mercilessly slaughtered. How do you feel after the grueling drudgery that we dealt with last week in terms of, you know, our famed send-off to the one and the only Sir Kristen Cole?
Yeah, I mean, I've made it pretty clear I never liked Kristen Cole, but he's a well-written character, and I'll give him that. Yeah, I mean, beat for beat, just basically how you described it, happened the exact same way in the books. Probably a little more drawn out. I think there was a bit more, you know, dialogue between Kristen Cole and you know, and the army and everything like that before he was kind of just insulted and then basically filled with arrows. But yeah, I really have nothing, I guess, to add really. I think it was faithful in the way that he went out. I didn't expect it to be super long or anything, but yeah, I know we've talked about this, is, you know, when we're talking about added plot lines and everything like that. This is definitely a plot line that I felt has dragged on for this entirety of the season. So I'm just glad, more honestly, that it's over, just so that we can kind of at least spend a little more time focusing on at least the more important aspects of the story. So.
Definitely. And it is kind of funny how this whole sequence, in addition to just being maybe the shortest battle sequence that we've ever seen in Game of Thrones, how it was almost kind of a meta acknowledgement of how far the show was surpassed the character, because the character, like Kristen Cole, was a pretty important character within that first season. And then just that now so much has happened. We've had so many new characters, so many new plot lines. All the characters that he was previously connected to have risen so far above him now that he's just literally just, like the character itself is, and I feel like us as the audience are just clinging to a memory of a show that's long since surpassed us. So I just thought that was a pretty funny meta acknowledgement by the show. Professor Pat, your thought on the opening sequence and the rather abrupt goodbye to Sir Kristen Cole?
You know, I gotta say, I think I wish I had this scene last week, just to give us. You know,
so do we all.
That episode.
So do we all.
But yeah, I think Christian Cole, like, you know, he's a great story in the show, but yeah, it does drag on, unfortunately, too long. He's been in that holding pattern of just moping around, like, you know, realizing that he's not going to, you know, have land and territory or anything like that, or any glory other than death on the battlefield. And, you know, I kind of like the story and I like the arc, But again, he's just sort of been strung along episode by episode, and finally he's just sort of is let go. It felt more like a anticlimactic HR meeting than a battle. But
Yeah.
to be honest, like I wish it was hyped up a little bit more. But like I said, the arc does make sense, and I did feel the emotion when he got those arrows, just struck into him.
Yeah, he was definitely trying to angle for more of an honorable death. But like I said, like the show's treatment, we will probably move on and say goodbye to Kristen Cole. You will probably be forgotten within the next 10 minutes. All right, so another plot line. Like I said, I will say the one thing that this episode, one of many things that the rest of this episode has going for over last week's is the fact that this is a very, very plot-focused episode. Almost every major character in the season up until this point who hasn't already died is in this episode and has some part to play in it. So first things first, another big fallout from a revelation that happened 2 episodes ago that they sort of kind of addressed in last week's episode, but only on one side, which is basically the full revelation. Rhaenyra now knows about Alicent's pregnancy in the sense of not Alicent's pregnancy, Helena's pregnancy, where Alicent and Helena attempted to keep the pregnancy a secret last week. Mysaria immediately figured it out. Then they just, but Alicent managed to convince Mysaria to keep it a secret by basically saying, don't put all your pennies in one basket over here. Then they discovered the secret patch at the end of last week's episode and then just ended up being trapped. So, and then it's only resulted in Alicent being forced to tell Rhaenyra because they literally have no other choice. I'm like, I feel like you could have skipped everything from last week and you literally just could have cut to this. You could have immediately just cut to this and you could have not had all the wherewithal of last week. But so Rhaenyra now knows. Alicent attempts to beg favor for Helena. But of course, Rhaenyra is literally like, well, what do you expect me to do? You tried to escape. If it's a boy, I'm literally going to be forced to hold it hostage. Pretty much everything that you said would happen. It will happen now. And now you're going to be confined even worse for this dumbass escape attempt of yours, And of course, Alicent is like, oh, Helena's fragile, this, that, the third. She won't do well. And Rhaenyra is like, tough shit. You still tried to escape. Like, it's like, what am I supposed to do? You put me in an impossible position here. So what are your guys' thoughts to Rhaenyra's reaction to Helena's pregnancy? Pat, we'll start with you.
I think these scenes between Alicent and Rhaenyra are kind of good. There is that still back and forth between them. I like Rhaenyra kind of struggling to rule the kingdom, and I think this is one of those things where it's like she wants to control the situation, but she knows that she's going to be forced to take action, and I feel that's kind of what Daemon's doing in terms of trying to goad her to use the dragons to strike and kill Ormond and everybody. So it's kind of like in every single thing that she's trying to manage. It's almost like everyone else's actions are forcing her into these impossible positions. And I think this is just one more way of putting those like, the weight on her shoulders until the straw sort of finally breaks.
Yeah, heavy is the crown has been the theme since episode 3, infamously entitled Rhaenyra Triumphant, which shows that her reign, despite being a lot easier, her ascension to the throne ended up being a lot easier than originally thought. The actual weight of the crown and her ability to rule, despite obviously a lot of it is because it is waylaid by Ormond Hightower, who is sabotaging her every second. But needless to say, it has not been easy, and kind of witnessing the crumbling that has been happening since she took the throne is definitely, I'm not gonna say it's a highlight, but it's certainly worth noting, especially given the fact that this is something that she fought for so long, and now it seems that everything that she has attempted to do has just been completely thwarted and taken away from her in the sense that she still has no idea where Aemond is. They're still in a mountain of debt she can't provide or feed her citizens. She has gold cloaks literally walking out on her because they can't afford to be paid. She's basically insulting and belittling every person who is loyal to her. Corlys, with not legitimizing the bastards, Hugh and Ulf, by not fulfilling the promises that she made to them when she first crowned them. Ulf in particular we've been focusing so much on Hugh, I feel like, for the last couple of episodes, that Ulf in particular, I feel like, gets a moment to be like, man, am I sure I made the right decision by taming that dragon and becoming loyal to her? Never in a million years did I feel like start to feel sympathy for a character whose name is literally Ulf. But in this instance, I kind of been starting to see where he's coming from. Yeah, he may suck and be completely, a complete depraved slob in the book, but at the very least here, they do a good enough job, I feel like, of showing like, yeah, I literally just tried to make myself, try to back up my claim for the lads. And now it's like, I can't even leave the castle except to go and run errands for the queen, who can't even, be bothered to fulfill a promise of giving me a castle, which I thought I was getting. And I can't even go out into the street to enjoy pie. And then I'm literally just sneaking off to try and get a drink with the lads. I run into Damon, and Damon, every chance he gets, is just smacking Ulf around. At first, it was well-deserved, but now it's like, my guy, he was literally just trying to get a drink, and you as the lone gold cloak smacking around somebody who to everybody else looks like a regular citizen. Not a good look. That's all I'm going to say. Eli, your reaction to Rhaenyra's reaction to Helena's pregnancy and just the overall, Ulf's overall thing in this episode.
Well, I definitely agree with you about everything last week just really being irrelevant if this is the conversation and how it was going to go. But I think it's just going to add more complexity and more just another just, I don't know what the analogy I was going to use, but basically just continuing to make Rhaenyra's head spin even further, which is another grape dropped on her plate. I don't know what I'm saying. I'm sorry. I'm sleep deprived, but she's got a lot to deal with, and now she's got a potential rival, inside the belly of one of her hostages, right, for the throne someday. If there's one thing we learn about the Targaryens, it's that they will just continue to just murder each other until there's really no one left. There's always another Targaryen propping up somewhere.
Yeah.
So,
exactly.
Overall, I'm sure we'll come back to the conversation she had with Alicent. I think her reaction was a little, maybe like slightly underwhelming, but that can probably just come down to like a writing or acting choice. I don't have too much to criticize there.
There's so much that she can do in the sense
Right.
where Alicent's her hostage, and Alicent, like, to some extent, even though, again, she has to, play the queen, to some extent, she does know that Alicent was acting as a desperate mother, or in this case, grandmother. It's still insane to me to think that Olivia Cook, who's only a couple years older than me, mother to a daughter in the show who was only 2 years younger than her in real life, which is just hilarious the way that all these castings ended up happening. Is a grandmother in the show, but hey, that's just the way that Westeros works. What are your thoughts on Ulf too?
In terms of Ulf, I think it's absolutely justified. I will say, I think he's at least been a character that hasn't really suffered from the bloat. It's at first, like, his first couple of like maybe scenes or episodes on his own after he gets the dragon, I'm like, okay, it's just more of this guy. But at least this season, I feel like he's had at least a well-realized arc so far where he's we can understand his feeling, actually,
yes.
That everything he's feeling, what he may be pushed to do in the future if everything continues to kind of go the way it's going for Rhaenyra, for Daemon, for how he's being treated. I feel like it's only going to kind of as you were saying earlier about that Rhaenyra is kind of just abandoning her allies now that she's on the throne. He's just kind of just one more person that really is not really getting what they wanted out of her rule. So
yeah, to say the least. And like I said, it's kind of insane how never in a million years did I think I would sympathize with a character like Ulf, who again is one of the most despicable characters in the book. But now, and again, the first couple episodes, again, Daemon obviously slapping him around and manhandling him every 5 seconds. I'm like, yeah, it was kind of justified given that, like I said, one of the jokes that I kept making in episode 2 when Daemon saw them back on Dragonstone is like, guys, you literally had one job to do and you couldn't even do that. So I kind of understood where they were coming from. But now it's like, I kind of get it, It's like unfortunately, you were promised a certain thing as a dragon rider. You did the impossible. You literally risked your life. You tamed a dragon, and now this is the reward you're getting. From the show standpoint, I kind of understand. Obviously, the translation for the book is a little willy-nilly.
Yeah, but it's like you said. I think he has a lot more humanity in the show than he does in the book, and he's definitely a character that I think has benefited from the adaptation rather than suffered. So.
One character who I'm not quite sure has benefited is his fellow dragon seed, Hugh Hammer, but we'll get to that in a little bit. I want to save him. First things, Mysaria covering herself against Rhaenyra, blatantly lying about Alicent having, did you suspect anything from Alicent? Mysaria saying no, so that shows that, okay, so Mysaria is definitely taking Alicent's words from last week into consideration. Okay, so last week's episode wasn't a total waste. Also, Rhaena in the Eyrie, I'm like, what? Do we need this scene at all? Where she like, okay, so she sees Baela and Adam flying around in the mountains, patrolling around, and then she ends up basically blowing her cover in order to try and make contact with her sister. And so I feel like this is another scene that weirdly enough could have been in last week's pointless episode, where it's like, oh, so this is a scene that will pay off in like the next 2 episodes, presumably. This shows that like her and her self-imposed exile with Sheepstealer will not last. They will come back into the fold and inevitably expose themselves, which will unfortunately, kind of ruin Daemon's whole covering up of that whole thing. Pat, so just in order to break it down, the big change with Rhaena, because I realize, this being your first time on the show, and you having not read the book to which this is based on. So they made a big change with Rhaena in the show. In the book, Rhaena never tames a dragon. Rhaena famously just goes and is basically acts as a caretaker to Rhaenyra's sons that are in Pentos. And funnily enough, actually, in the book, Rhaena ends up hatching the last dragon, who is like a baby dragon named Morning. And then the character who tamed Sheepstealer in the book is a whole new character named Nettles. And then what they did was a thing that they did classically in the original Game of Thrones, where they essentially compressed and combined 2 characters, where they essentially mixed Rhaena's want and need for a dragon and combined her with the character of Nettles, had her tame Sheepstealer, the wild dragon, and then they also significantly changed the Battle of the Gullet as well, in which her interfering in that battle ultimately was what resulted in Jace's death, which was also not what happened in the book. So your thoughts in general on the whole Rhaena arc up until this point, since like I said, since this is your first episode being back on the show.
Yeah, it's going back to, the adaptation and changing it into a new medium. I like the idea of consolidating these 2 characters. Very much so because, like you said, the book is from an unreliable source. It's basically a bunch of stories kind of brought together by someone who might not necessarily be like writing the absolute truth. And it's just heard stories. And so with this show, because it's a visual medium and our eyes don't lie to us, we're seeing certain things portrayed in the show, and seeing how it could fit into the written story, the text. And I find that's a little bit part of the fun of the show. When I watch some YouTube videos and they discuss a lot of the history of the books, or the book, it's kind of enjoyable to see what the differences and changes are. So I think that's part of the enjoyment of the show. I do think that the show does kind of, pepper in the setups a little much. Where does this scene play out? I guess we'll see next week, or obviously the week after. But it's kind of, I'm left wanting a little bit more than just a slap in the throne room with the moon door being teased.
Yeah, exactly. Especially because we know that the moon door, that's not necessarily going to go anywhere, And obviously, if this is setting up for Rhaena and Sheepstealer to participate in an upcoming battle that could potentially expose her as the perpetrator in Jace's death, which is the whole reason why she was hiding, which would also, again, expose Daemon and fray his relationship with Rhaenyra, which we know Eli, as book readers, will presumably lead to his battle with Aemon at the God's Eye. So again, it's a scene that's just thrown in there. It's a setup scene, so that's that. I'm gonna wait to cover Alan and Corlys. We'll cover that once we cover the end bit and mix that in with Tumbleton. So right now, I want to talk about Aemon and Alis and Harrenhal. So last week was the first time that we had seen Aemon since his since his taking over of Harrenhal. We still have no idea where Vhagar is. He's basically him and Alis. Last week, we're basically like Alis was helping him recover, and then he was basically just like killing. Alis was basically turning away squads of soldiers that had been sent to try and kill him for the bounty that had been placed on his head. And then he ended up defending her and killing killing one of the squad of soldiers at the end of last week. This week, he is basically now, every chance he gets, trying to leave Alis. He's like, I need to go out. I need to find Vhagar. I'm nothing without my dragon. And Alis is basically telling him all these reasons why she wants him to stay. Or rather, she's putting it in such a way that he should stay because it would be beneficial for him, when in reality you can tell they're like, oh, she's lonely, but also she wants a Targaryen to rule through. And, obviously she's also looking to get back at Rhaenyra and Daemon for spiting her when she helped them last season. So, Pat, what are your thoughts on the whole Aemon-Alis relationship, especially building off that frightful moment at the beginning of the season when Aemon kissed Alicent, the whole mommy complex thing?
Yeah, this show does not get away from that mommy complex. We basically have, obviously the houses of ill repute in King's Landing that he constantly frequents, and he found a mother figure there. He basically is a little bit messed up in the head in that territory. But I think Alice Rivers and him sort of having this weird connection, and obviously she has some sort of mystical powers and is manipulating him. this is probably the biggest test that he'll have to face, in terms of, giving up control to Alice Rivers. Or does, he mutually benefit from this relationship? And, I don't know where it goes, but I'm interested to see where this dynamic plays out.
We're in a little bit of uncharted territory for sure, because I don't think that Aemon was apart from Vhagar, if at all, for this longest time. And Aemon obviously is a character who, up until this point, his entire character journey has been defined by the fact that he tamed the biggest, largest dragon, who, despite the fact that obviously Rhaenyra's side vastly outnumbers the green side, the fact was the Greens always had an advantage because they had Vhagar on their side, so much so that even when Rhaenyra went out and got 3 new dragon riders at the end of last season to tame Sea Smoke, Vermithor, and Silverwing, who are 3 pretty big and battle-hardened dragons that would presumably turn the tide, there was still that overwhelming fear of Vhagar. But now that Aemon has been injured, recovering, and has been separated from Vhagar for most of it, we're seeing him in a new light, in a new vulnerable way that we really haven't seen from him since he was a kid, before he tamed Vhagar. And now, so obviously he's in a vulnerable place there. We know he's got the mommy complex, which Alice is obviously preying on. It makes this dynamic a little bit more interesting than Daemon just kind of sitting there wasting away while he was at Harrenhal all last season. And so then you obviously have the revelation of Alice revealing that she has a clutch of Dreamfire's eggs that she had basically been keeping there since Aemon's ancestor, Rhaena, who I believe was one of the sisters of, or maybe the aunt of Jacaerys the First, Jacaerys the Conciliator, the original rider of Vermithor, had left there from when they rode there, ages ago. Eli, as the resident book reader here, does this break any book canon? And what do you think of the whole Alice-Aemon relationship that's happening here?
So yes, it does. Alicent, I won't obviously spoil anything, but Alicent still has some kind of role to play in King's Landing, in terms of the kind of end.
No, not Alicent. We're not getting there yet. Alice Rivers.
Oh, Alice, duh. No, Alice was a
How many times can we screw up a Game of Thrones name? Check one.
Yeah, it also doesn't help. I'm running on 3 hours of sleep, where I'm the names sound so similar. I'm definitely gonna. It probably won't even be the last time tonight I do that. But Alice Rivers was a pretty minor character in the book. As far as I know, as far as I'm remembering, there isn't at least this level of connection that she has with Aemon, or even really Daemon. When that was going on. She's definitely someone that they're propping up more for the adaptation. And as a book reader, I don't mind it, because obviously I think it's the whole magical element side of things, right? Like, the magic in this world is very unpredictable, uncontrollable in a lot of ways. I think throwing in a character that has this weird connection to the magical elements in the story only creates a kind of a new, like an interesting layer. Like, she's just one of those characters that might be known about in history, but her place is not yet fully realized. And I think her being able to manipulate some kind of outcome, whether it's accurate to the book or maybe impact something that maybe we as the reader, don't really know might happen. I think it's actually something I'm more interested in, and I think they're handling her character pretty well. So I'm all for everything she's been doing. I like that we at least kind of know her motive now more in this episode, and her secret plans makes me kind of question things a little bit from season 2. Now that it's I can understand it, because
in terms of her revealing the eggs to Aemon now, but never telling Daemon about it. I would say that's her hedging, or I actually may have an explanation for that in terms of maybe just from a show standpoint, because to me that's her hedging her bets, because obviously both because she was such a new character and we still kind of had to be introduced to her and the mysticism and the kind of the cursed nature of Harrenhal, but also the fact that she kind of probably got a sense early on that Daemon wasn't necessarily the most trustworthy character, considering that she was plaguing him with visions nonstop, but it didn't end up ultimately working in her favor, versus Aemon. The difference is that Daemon came, the castle was still technically under the control of Simon Strong, who was trying to placate him wherever he could. And Daemon he came in a position of triumph, in a position of anger. Aemon, when he arrived, he was coming from a position of weakness, of hurt, of anger. He immediately killed Simon Strong and his sons before getting brutally injured himself. So he was kind of, let's say, easier prey for Alice to manipulate, So I think that's the first thing that's the first reason why she feels like she can trust Aemon even more than she did Daemon, if that's the word that I would use, which again I wouldn't. I would use it much more so as manipulation, but also in the sense of us finally getting a little bit of a clue into her motivations in terms of, okay, so she's essentially seeking to use Aemon to produce more Targaryen heirs. That would be powered by her magic, whatever the hell it is, whether she's a green seer or whether she is secretly a red priestess of Ashai, like Melisandre. I don't necessarily think that's the case. But obviously they would then harness the power of this clutch of dragon eggs that she's been keeping safe for God only knows how many years, and they would presumably, rise up and rule from there, and that would be kind of her means of asserting and taking over power. So I, at the very least, appreciate that they're trying to give her something more to do, other than, you're right, just her kind of being this mysterious background figure in the book who's just kind of there to support Aemon, at certain point, who, again, is a pretty one-note, just kind of despicable evil character in the book. And I like that we're getting some slight more layers to Aemon, other than just like, oh, I have a mommy complex and I'm nothing without my dragon. Like we're starting to get a little bit more there. It's not quite there yet, but it's getting there. So I appreciate that. It's getting there, especially given how the episode ends with a drastic left turn change that definitely was not in the books. Couple more check-ins, though, before we get to that big twist. Obviously, we haven't covered Tumbleton yet, but Hugh sneaking into Tumbleton. And I'm sorry, I'm still lost as far as how this is going to lead up to the big Dragon Seed betrayal. They've pretty much laid all the seeds for all. That one makes perfect sense if and when that happens. But Hugh, I'm still confused, man. I'm like, okay, so is this another character getting cucked, where obviously Daemon has unfortunately become the great cuck of this season, and now we have Hugh, who this entire time, right? Hugh was a character in the book who was set up as basically ultimately being a Machiavel in disguise, where the whole motivation behind his betrayal was the fact that he basically prophesied himself with a crown on his head. And you thought there was maybe a little inclination of that at the end of last season, when he had the big, kind of shit-eating grin on his face when he tamed Vermithor. And then at the beginning of the season, when him, Adam, and Ulf were on the Isle of Faces, and he saw the Green Seer man, which, I don't know, maybe that could be misinterpreted. And then obviously, ever since Ormond's forces took over Tumbleton, he's been worried about his wife. He volunteered to go and patrol the city on Vermithor. But so in this episode, we finally get sort of a payoff where he sneaks into the city. We've seen his wife be brutalized, his wife's family brutalized at the hands of Ormond's men. Her brother Darren being forced to kill him 2 episodes ago. And now he sneaks into the city. He reunites. He finally has this long-awaited reunion with Kat, and Kat has this reaction to him where she's like, I don't recognize you anymore. You're not the man I married. You abandoned us. Now you kind of fly above us. I can no longer relate to you. You're in this position of power. Eli, what are your thoughts on this? Especially since Kat is a completely made-up character for the purpose of the show.
Yeah, I'm not really sure where they're going with him. I've mentioned it like maybe 1 or 2 times. I'm not really sure where they're going with any of the dragon seeds. I mean, Ulf is pretty clear, but Hugh, I'm not really sure. Adam, don't even get me started.
Well, it's funny actually, because that does bring it to a point that I'll come into later on, but I guess I'll get to it now, which is that Adam, who was set up as being the most loyal of Rhaenyra's dragon seeds, has had the least amount of screen time of, I think, any character this entire season. I think Kat, Hugh's wife, an imaginary character made up for the show, has had more screen time than Adam, who is one of the most important characters in the books. And now we could potentially getting some motivation for him for Tumbleton because of basically the fact that Baela, now in the wake of Jace's death, is relegated to basically being forced to choose between which of her 2 Valyrian uncles, right? Valyrian half-uncles to choose from as far as who could be a romantic prospect. I mean, I get it. It's Targaryens, like, incest abounds, but, like, you have to see with her and Alan in the dragon pit, and I'm like, oh, Adam was kind of, hitting on her in last week's episode, and now this week, she's like, oh, so now Alan, now she's hitting on Alan. I'm like, oh, so this is setting up for some 3-way dynamic, and that could serve as motivation for why Adam's going to go off and die at Tumbleton. Spoilers if you haven't read the book, but man, I'm just like, I'm even more confused about Hugh, because every single time I try to come up with a new theory as far as how he's going to be motivated to betray Rhaenyra at Tumbleton, I'm continuously baffled by where the show is taking him.
Yeah, and I think kind of going back to my comment earlier about the show just being bloated, I can understand it. I truly can, especially with like dragging out Kristen Cole. At least what happened to him in Butcher's Ball happens at least in the order of the events that happen in the book, right? But then adding in like another character that just like I can understand it, right? You want to give a little more, I guess, context to Hugh's character, whatever it might be. I just really don't see where it's going, and for her to be taking this much screen time away from someone like Adam, that obviously is pretty important, and what I don't get is if you're going to drag out Kristen Cole but not drag out Adam this season,
Right.
especially when these two big events are going to be pretty close to each other. I don't know. I'm sure it comes down to the actors and probably some contract they had somewhere or anything, but it's a bit frustrating. And I will say that is, like, we talk about the pacing. That's one of my biggest complaints with the show. Like, is it a nightmare to probably produce this and to juggle everything that's going on? Yes, absolutely. And that's why I'm not as hesitant to criticize, these sorts of things. But I don't know. I really don't know. I don't know if we needed Kat and, this side plot with her brother and everything. At the same time, it does tie into to everything going on with the high towers, but it's I don't know. I really have no idea what to expect from Hugh in the coming episodes, which I guess is a good and a bad thing as a book reader. But
yeah, I think that's ultimately kind of where I'm at, because this really just might be one of those instances where we are kind of handicapped as book readers as far as knowing what will happen. But because, again, it's not a straight narrative, we don't know the steps that will lead us to that, And obviously we know that given the deviations they've already made, the betrayal of the Dragon Seeds is going to be significantly different than how it happened in the book. And I just wanted to point out that so far, Adam's only screen time has consisted of the scene in the first episode with him basically telling Hugh and Ulf to not abandon their mission, him searching for Corlys, and then having that weird, interesting meeting with Alan, Corlys, and Bela, just watching High Tide burn. Him sitting awkwardly with Alan as Rhaenyra and Corlys are arguing as far as whether to legitimize them. And then the weird scene in last week's episode where him and Bela have just been searching, basically because him and Bela this entire season, ever since Gullet, have basically just been flying around the realm on Sea Smoke and Moondance, just looking for Vhagar, which is just hilarious considering that they're two of the smallest dragons, and you're sending them to look for Vhagar, and then you're having Vermithor and Silverwing, two of the biggest dragons who would have the best matchup against Vhagar, sit at Tumbleton. Like the logic, the dragon logic there is just hilarious to me. Pat, now
there's a couple things logic-wise that I think are a little.
Couple things, yeah. Now, Pat, as somebody who has not read the book and probably has no idea what we're talking about with the Betrayal of the Dragon Seeds, what did you think of Hugh's actions in this episode and trying to reunite with his wife?
I feel like it's the expected part of the storyline. Like, Hugh's gonna try to get into the city and see his wife, and obviously he's trying to pull her out of there without using the force of the dragon. I personally thought like it would have been a great sequence if he got into the city, he got to her when she started freaking out, almost like drawing attention to him, and then some sort of negative impact would have happened. It like as it stands, he kind of just like we end it. There is really no consequence for him entering the city. But this was a moment I thought where we could actually see a consequence, see how he handles it, and maybe just like raise the stakes for what's to come. So I do get it. It's kind of character development, but I didn't feel like it really did much to help what's going to happen in the 2 episodes that we still have to watch this season.
Yeah, I think that's kind of where, obviously, again, where this show kind of suffers in comparison to its predecessor, because by virtue of the fact that these are shortened seasons, the original Game of Thrones were 10-episode seasons, and this show, with the exception of the first season, has been 8-episode seasons. Also, the fact that so much of the story has been truncated because of a lot of the behind-the-scenes events as well. Game of Thrones to me always worked out so well because it was the perfect intersection between plot and character development. And this show, I feel like, is constantly trading up one for another. It's either so heavy on plot that the character development lapses, or they focus so much on these brief little character moments to the point where the plot stalls. And it feels like ever since season one was like the perfect moment where all of that was just gelling together. And then somewhere halfway through, I thought they had a pretty good momentum going throughout season 2 up until after Rook's Rest. And after Rook's Rest, I feel like it just stalled out, where it's like, okay, we either have these episodes that are just kind of basically filler, and I've said this before, it is ridiculous that we have any sort of filler in 8-episode long seasons, or we get these and then by virtue of that fact, we end up getting these episodes that are so truncated and so filled with plot that were just jumping around beat to beat to beat. And we have these weird character moments like with Hugh where there's no payoff there. What would have been so much more interesting is if he had been captured by the High Towers and brought before Ormond and Gwaine, and what would have happened, and, and that's how that plot line would have ended, instead of just, okay, he just gets into a fight with Kat and then she rejects him, and then that's how it ends. Like it's just little moments like that are just kind of really forcing me to see the cracks in the armor with this season specifically in ways that I was kind of being more willing to forgive in the past. Just another brief moment as well. We briefly check in with Aegon as well. Aegon Larys, who have now been joined by Tywin Lannister, who survived the Battle of the Gullet. But that's just mostly like a brief joke moment where basically Aegon tests Tywin by seeing if he's as brutally honest as Larys. And then when Tywin is inevitably unable to answer because Tywin is not the skilled Machiavel and politician that Larys is, who basically knows exactly what to do and what to say to every person at every moment, Tywin is nothing more than a glorified servant. And he basically is like, when Aegon asks him the question that Larys basically chewed him out for last episode, where he's like, you are a terrible person, you are a terrible king, and your idiocy is basically what got us here. Aegon asks Tywin, am I a terrible person? And Tywin just stutters nonstop to the point where he's like, all right, so we're doing what Larys says basically from here on out. And that's just a brief moment again but we all know where that plot line is going. So that's just, we're kind of just like biding our time there.
Yeah, Dom, it's weird that's kind of my favorite part of the episode is these three people.
Why does that not surprise me? Knowing what I know about you, why does that not surprise me in the slightest?
I don't know. It's the end of last episode when he actually kills the guy that discovers his crown, and you just see Larys kind of like, oh man, this guy, I can't take him anywhere. It's almost like it's the Three Stooges, and you kind of expect something to happen in the woods, just to make you laugh, and it's probably the best comedic relief the show has this season, I think.
Yeah, for sure. Like, especially because most of the season it's just been like Aegon and Larys just trying to get from one spot to another and being waylaid by literally every chance they have. They've basically become like the Arya and the Hound of this season, like way back in Game of Thrones season 3. And while certain moments definitely it feels like are getting dragged out with them, I do tend to like that, mostly because again, just the actors Tom Glencarny and Matthew Needham do such a good job as well. Now they've been joined by Jefferson Hall, which, by the way, Pat, I don't know if you knew this, but Jefferson Hall, the actor who plays Tywin Lannister, is actually a Game of Thrones alumni. He had a brief bit in the first season of Game of Thrones way back in the day as Sir Hugh, that Aaron Squire who ends up getting a pike to the throat by the mountains. So, like I said, brief blinker, you'll miss it, like if you're super deep in the weeds with the lore like I am. But so two major things that end this episode. Let's go to Tumbleton now, where again, Tumbleton has kind of been like a center point of this season ever since the Blacks effectively took Green's Landing and effectively cut off the Greens at any chance they had, executing Otto Hightower. We've been spending a lot of time with Ormond, getting to know him and his relationship with Darren as well. And throughout the last couple of episodes, we see kind of the cunning Machiavel that Ormond is, how he is, we've been seeing it basically as this like kind of strategic mastermind who has been running circles around Rhaenyra as far as ruling, sabotaging her every chance we get. We've seen like kind of what an evil, cunning, despicable person he was in terms of his mistreatment and how he's raised Darren. Now, in this episode, we finally get to see some more expansion on that. I will say, every time we cut back to Tumbleton, those have consistently been my favorite parts of the season, where now that Gwaine has abandoned Kristen Cole, we see him back with his family members, Ormond and Darren, and we finally get to see, I would say, a British act-off that I've been waiting for a long time, which any fan of British television knows that Freddie Fox and James Norton are two heavyweights, and now seeing them finally get to go mano a mano in the same room, especially knowing what we have known about them based off of how they have talked with each other respectively independently of each other. It's nice to see them finally in the same room, first as rivals, then as forced allies when the attempted assassination by the Baratheon impersonators happens. Eli, your thoughts on this whole sequence and everything that happens in Tumbleton with Gwaine and Ormond and their respective kind of treatments of Darren, and finally seeing that coalesce?
Yeah, I've actually been I've been excited to talk about this. This was actually my favorite part of the episode, was Gwaine inserting himself into everything going on at Tumbleton. I really liked the perspective that he brought to all this, where it just, most of this season, it's not really his fault, but just he has been just a background, just the guy to, basically just bounce off dialogue with Cole, as he's marching to his death. But now that we're able to see him like back around the Hightower element and everything like that, seeing this dynamic that he has with Daeron is really really cool. And we're finally being able to see Darren open up and be like, I don't want to fucking be here. I
Yeah.
don't want to be king.
We're finally getting more layers to Darren as a character,
Yes,
who up until this point has
exactly.
kind of just been reduced to being Ormond's whipping boy, and now you finally see that, like, no, he is an actual person underneath, like, the pristine trophy that Ormond is just constantly throwing out to be viewed by people.
Exactly, and kind of reinforcing kind of what everyone feels about about the situation going on.
Oh, man.
I liked every single bit of dialogue that he had. I think it was, it's nice to just see. I don't know, like the assassination attempt didn't
It's
happen in the
awesome.
books, but I think it adds to Wayne's character. Like he pays attention to these sorts of things. He's not an idiot. Like we've at least seen kind of has been portrayed. Again, not really his fault, just most of the season. He didn't even have much to do in the earlier episodes that he was in. But this is absolutely, I think, his episode to shine. I was really, I think it, like you said, it brought a lot of layers to the conflict going on, to everything going on with the High Towers and Tumbleton. I think seeing that side of Darren is really interesting, and I think Wayne kind of having his own ambitions, if when this whole operation fails, is it's also really cool. So
Yeah, Gwaine went from having the stupidest name in the entire Game of Thrones verse to
Agreed.
maybe being my favorite character in this whole season. And I will say it makes me both hate this season and that stupid Kristen Cole plotline this season even more, knowing that we wasted so much goddamn time out of the fact that we were robbed of more moments like that. Because now seeing what the true potential that this show in this season has, with seeing Gwaine finally back with his cousin, who we talked so much shit about in the last season, and we finally, because what it does is it finally shows us what Gwaine is as a character. It shows us, like, yeah, he might be the most sensible person in this entire show, where he's basically telling Ormond, he's like, so your plan is effectively to wait it out here, sabotage Rhaenyra, and hope that she doesn't send her dragons to roast you all alive, based off on a whim that she is too merciful towards wanting to kill her people, which, in fairness, Ormond has banked off pretty well off that so far. But Gwaine is like, dude, there's only so much longer that can last. And, like, we know that the only reason, our side is effectively lost. Like, Aegon is presumed dead. Aemond is nowhere to be found. You're propping up Darren as a king only to serve your own ambition for power. Like, this will not end well. And at first he wants to go back to Tumbleton. He basically is about to declare not Tumbleton. He wants to go back to Old Town. He wants to basically consider this thing a lost cause, knowing that when they presumably die, he'll be the only High Tower left to pick up the pieces. But Darren, and also then the assassination attempt, is enough to convince him to stay. And I'll tell you this much too, for as much as Ormond disrespects him, Gwaine proves himself in a big, big way in that sense, because Ormond is finally like, I misjudged you. Now let me bring you into the inner circle and let you know what my plan is, which obviously leads to the sequence that happens at the end, but we'll get into that. Pat, your thoughts on kind of this whole sequence and the whole Tumbleton arc and Hightower arc up until this point?
Yeah, I think Gwaine has been portrayed throughout the series before this as someone that is kind of capable and able to sort of do his duty and do it well. And I think this particular scene where he spots the assassins and basically takes charge and swords them all down, I think is really great. It really amps up his character, and the fact that we are now seeing a dynamic between Ormond himself and Daron. I think that dynamic is growing. It's not just Ormond torturing this poor young kid. We're going to see a little bit of play between the three of them and see where it leads us going forward. Um, and overall, I think Ormond is like a great bad guy for this. I think my expectations after the first two episodes of the season, Rhaenyra is kind of cemented her rule, and Ormond's sort of a growing character. I thought like halfway through the season they would take care of this, and then we move on to more problems. But he's the season bad, and we'll see what happens at the very end. We got those two more episodes, and I'm curious to see where this plot line comes to a head.
Yeah, a couple people were comparing Ormond to a younger version of Tywin Lannister. I wouldn't necessarily go that far. To me, he is much more, I would say, of a Roose Bolton, waiting in the shadows, to make his move properly, but I would say definitely a lot more. He's Roose Bolton, but with Ramsay's level of ambition, basically, where he is not nearly as savage as Ramsay, but he's willing to do what he needs to do in order to get what he wants with the, unless of course he's in the presence of, disgusting shit and dirt covered men, which then immediately causes him to lose control of his senses, quite literally, and just vomit all up. That was just hilarious to witness, and knowing that was the payoff of his, constantly enmeshing himself, and his sensitivity to smell, I thought was just that was a great payoff there as well.
It's a great character trait that they really capitalized on in this episode for sure. Just like the smell of the soldiers and the smell of death. And then he basically humbles himself all over his dinner. And it's one of those things where this is the type of character that does so much chaos and destruction and killing of his own. But when he's sort of faced with it right there at his table, he can't really handle it. So it kind of shows you this dichotomy of who this character is.
Indeed. And like I've been saying pretty much since the first episode of our recap this season, if you want somebody to play a smug asshole who is full of himself than anyone else, you get James Norton to play him, because he plays that type of character better than anybody else. And I love to also, in addition, this is my last note on that before we move on to the final plotline this episode, the dichotomy between Gwaine and Ormond, where Ormond is, big, burly, he towers over his cousin, but you realize that he's got such a fragile state, such a fragile ego. He's such a sore loser. He can't even lose to his own goddamn nephew in chess. He tries to split a table with a sword the minute that he hears news that he doesn't like, versus Gwaine, who comes off as kind of more of a shrimpy dude. Gwaine is very smart, very intelligent, very quick-witted, spots the assassins almost immediately once he realizes that they don't fit the traits of the Baratheons that they claim to be, and again, proves to be pretty quick-witted and also caring in a way that Ormond isn't. He shows that he genuinely cares about Darren and that he wants good things to happen to him. So everything that happened in this sequence, I absolutely love. Once again, Tumbleton proves to be the highlight of not only this episode, but the season. And that brings us to the last bit. So it's kind of a two-pronged effort here, where first it's King's Landing, where basically Rhaenyra decides, or after Alicent makes a final plea for Helena's mental state, that she will basically use Helena's abilities of, basically foresight, which Rhaenyra buys into, because obviously there's history of this within in the Targaryen lineage, the idea of Targaryens having the ability of foresight, in order to use that to Rhaenyra's advantage. And she basically confesses oh, Aemond is at Harrenhal. And Rhaenyra's like, oh my God, you're going to tell me something. Vhagar hasn't been seen. He's like, I said Aemond was at Harrenhal, not Vhagar, which immediately makes Rhaenyra click into mind a place where it's like, oh, if Aemond is without his dragon, then that means he's vulnerable and I could get him. And so she's like, Alicent, he trusts you. Why don't you go out on this obvious suicide mission in order to kill your own son? And Alicent is like, but of course Alicent realizes that she has placed herself right between a rock and a hard place. And then we have the payoff to Corlys, who we haven't seen since episode 4, when he basically abandoned Rhaenyra to basically go off and fight pirates alone. And you have this moment where Alan comes up to him in order to try and request more Valyrian men in order to reinforce the city. He basically says no. But then after Alan calls him out for his hypocrisy, when, he's like, your whole thing of being mad at Rhaenyra is because she wouldn't legitimize me, but how long did it take for you to even recognize me as your son, to even consider me for legitimacy? So finally calling out that thing that we were talking about after the first 2 episodes. I was like, kind of convenient that you waited until your entire fortune and legacy was gone in order to legitimize your sons, kind of crazy as far as how that goes. But then at the end, you have this moment where they're basically presumably getting ready to head towards King's Landing when they are attacked/apprehended by Hightower men led by Ormond's bodyguard, Bull John Roxton. Now, did he kill him? Did he kidnap him? We don't know. That is left ambiguous. But considering the fact that we thought the Tylan was dead for the majority of this season before he popped up alive, and knowing obviously Corlys Valyrian's fate within the rest of the books, it's very interesting because this is another big change that they made. Also, Eli, we also got the iconic Rhaenyra cutting herself on the throne room. And as soon as that happened, she immediately looks at the statue of Viserys, because Viserys cutting himself on the throne was basically, kind of the beginning of the end for him. So, Eli, your thoughts on kind of the ending sequence of this episode? Rhaenyra sending Alicent out on the suicide mission and Corlys' apprehension by the High Towers.
Yeah, really, I don't know how this Alicent plotline is really going to pan out. And I struggle to get behind it entirely, just because you're asking a mother to go kill her own son, right?
Yeah.
I know end of season 2, she's willing to give up her other son that is now
Like, but
disappeared.
just from
Right?
a logistical
But
standpoint, too, it's not the best because even when the Greens tried to do something like this last season, when Aegon had Cole send the one twin, Sir Eric, to pose as his twin brother in order to try and kill Rhaenyra, even that, foolhardy as that mission was, even that made more sense than this.
right. Yeah, I agree. This is something that did not happen in the books, so again, I know I was my tangent earlier, but Alicent's still has a role to play in King's Landing. So I'm curious, not entirely against it, but mostly I'm more skeptical than anything that this will work well with the source material, with everything that it feels like they're building towards. And I don't know. I'm all for it. Like I said, I'm all for changes as long as they can do them well. And in terms of some of the changes from the book, we've had a mixed bag, as we've already kind of discussed with this season alone. But in terms of the scene where she cut herself, I know Luke and I, when Luke was on, we were talking about it. Definitely been waiting for this moment this season. Didn't happen like around a moment that I thought would happen, but I think it's still, the symbolism hits hard for it, I think. And I still think they achieved their goal. And her looking at like the pillar with the statue that seemed to resemble her father the most. I don't know if it's ever like really confirmed that is her father or not.
I mean,
but,
we can assume that that's
right,
Viserys,
right.
especially because they've been talking about it a lot. And just as well, too, also, Alicent being missing, it's like, okay, so this is another instance where we as book readers, it's kind of similar with Hugh, we're like, okay, how does this affect what we know or think will happen with Helena, especially since they've already changed the whole Maelor thing, where she's pregnant with Maelor rather than Maelor already being an existing character.
Right. And on the topic of Helena, if we're going to still bash the things that happened from the last episode, one thing that they did make pretty clear is how she does not want to be trapped, right? She wants her freedom. She doesn't want to be confined. And now her imprisonment is only going to be even tighter after this escape attempt. Especially her sitting in that dark room. You can tell she's been kind of messed up by that a little bit. She's in a pretty rough spot. And obviously, I keep touching on the magic is always my favorite part of this universe. How her magic will tie into everything is still something that I'm really crossing my fingers on and just praying that the writers really give us, us long-term fans, book fans, just something that works, but also is a deviation from the book where, something happens with the magic that we never really could see from
and if we're going based off of on next week's episode, because I always watch those every week, we see a sequence of Rhaenyra attempting to pressure Helena to use her magic for her benefit. So I'm wondering how that will factor in.
Yeah. Okay. See, that's again.
I'm telling you, like I said,
skip the promos every single week.
Normally I don't, but in this case, I feel like they are essential in terms of like helping to theorize as far as like what could happen, especially knowing what we know and how they've been deviating from the book up until this point.
No, that's totally fair.
Yeah. What's it called, Pat? Yeah, your thoughts on the whole Rhaenyra Alicent suicide mission thing and how that's going to affect Helena potentially?
Yeah, I'm curious to see how it plays out. I feel like it gets Alicent out of the house, so to speak, which she has been in the castle the whole season. So I would be happy to see what she can do in the world, and it's also going to be a catalyst for the Alice Rivers and the Aegon storyline to do something.
Aemon.
So Aemon, yeah. So
how many times can we screw up on Targaryen thing? That's 2 strikes.
It happens, and like Eli,
I've had a running ticker somewhere. We were doing pretty good. We had a lot of screw ups. We had a lot of screw ups last week, or maybe it was 2 weeks ago. I don't remember.
Yeah, it's one of those things where I hope it's a catalyst. I hope it moves that storyline forward. I'm looking for, I guess, a little more aggressive progression in some of these storylines than the subtle week to week that we have been having. And with 2 episodes left, I hope we can return to that. But my wish for like a 4th season, if it's too early to put it on the wish list, would be like just a little more aggressive with the week to week plot lines. Would be really good. So I'm hopeful that this sequence that we see in the next episode will be just that. Yeah.
Indeed. And then Pat, your last bit, your thoughts on the Corlys Velaryon thing, and his inclusion in this episode, how they kind of backseated him after he was basically angered at Rhaenyra, and now obviously with the High Towers apprehending him. Like, I'll say this: so in the book, Corlys Velaryon famously switches sides after, but the circumstances that lead to it in the book are significantly different. Like, there's no him abandoning Rhaenyra and him getting potentially apprehended or even worse, killed by the High Towers. We have no clue. That, like I said, so we're, as far as Corlys goes, we're in uncharted territory. So what are your thoughts on that?
I was kind of a little bit, I would say, confused that the High Tower, basically, Ormond's second in command there, this very stoic guy, I forgot his name.
Famously called Bold John Roxton.
Yeah, there it is. But basically, him showing up at the end of the episode and essentially kidnapping Corlys is very interesting. So it kind of jumps from the assassination sequence, and then it's almost like immediately after that. So I wasn't really expecting it. It kind of just like really is like almost like a jump cut in my mind. Like, oh, and also in the same night he kidnapped this guy.
Yeah, the sense of timing between scenes throughout the show of House of the Dragon is much more similar to later season Game of Thrones than early season Game of Thrones, which famously people were very, very critical of that continent hopping that was happening in the later seasons of Game of Thrones, which I know you and I talked about on the show, Pat.
Yeah, for sure. And it's perfectly fine to have this plot point in this episode. It leaves a little bit of mystery. I don't think there's any mystery whether they like kill him or kidnap him or whatever it is. It's if they were going to kill him, the show is not shy about showing you that they kill him. So
famously, the rule is that with the exception of Stannis Baratheon, if there's no body, they're not dead.
Yeah, exactly. So I think the main thing is we'll see how it plays out. Interesting to hear that he has a little bit of a betrayal to Rhaenyra coming up, and I think it would be pretty interesting to see what happens when he's in captivity with the enemy, and he obviously has some anger towards his his queen. So maybe it just plays out in a different way. That could be a little more interesting in terms of the way the TV series set it up.
Indeed. Now, Eli, your thoughts on the whole Corlys bit to end the episode and how that deviates from what we know happens with him in the books?
Well, this just never happens. He just basically continues to serve as Rhaenyra's hand up until he kind of flip sides, which isn't for at least a little while.
Well, I mean, it doesn't help that, basically once Rhaenyra has gone full Mad Queen and orders all the dragon seeds to be executed, that he basically helps Adam escape and then gets thrown in jail as a result of it. That'll do a little bit in terms of like flipping alliances,
Yeah, just slightly.
Just a little bit.
It makes me wonder if I imagine he's going to be at least placed in front of Ormond at some time in the next episode. I'm sure there will be a conversation, right? We hear Ormond, I think it was last week's episode, admire and like talk about how he admired Corlys and everything. So I almost wonder if Ormond is going to try and persuade him into taking some kind of action that shapes, the rest of the season, might shape, Rhaenyra's downfall or help it to take further shape, I guess I should say.
I mean, I would assume so, given the fact that the last scene that we see of Gwaine and Ormond is basically Ormond being like, okay, you've proved yourself. Let me tell you what the plan is. And then the next scene, obviously, it's Rhaenyra receiving the Baratheon cloak with the message on it, and then it's Corlys at the campfire being apprehended by Bold John and the High Tower men. And so I'm like, okay, we can assume based on what's been shown to us that like this is definitely gonna have. So Corlys Velaryon still has a big part to play throughout the rest of the show, especially given that, like, unfortunately, the way that it goes in the book, after the Battle of the Gullet, he really doesn't have much to do other than serve Rhaenyra and then just get thrown in jail when the betrayal of the dragon seeds happens.
Right. No, absolutely.
Yeah, so that, like I said, setting us up for a very interesting last two episodes as far as where this could go. Like I said, definitely a vast improvement over last week's episode. Still a couple of confusing things here or there, but we're finally done with Kristen Cole. We can finally move on to bigger and better things, hopefully, as we wrap up this season and get prepped for the fourth and final season, which will be occurring in 2 years. Thank you, gentlemen, once again for joining me for another episode of House of the Dragon. Pat, thanks once again for making your return to the Game of Thrones verse. You were sorely missed. Where can the good people follow you on the interwebs?
Hey, right now I'm just rocking my Instagram handle, so at Patrick W. Huber. You can see what I got going on there.
Definitely. And you will be on the show much more before the end of the year. Eli, where can the good people follow you on the interwebs?
Hey, same here. Pretty much same thing here, folks. I just got an Instagram. If you want to shoot me a follow, it's E_Holicky, like it's spelled on the screen here. E_Holicky45 on Instagram. Always love talking storytelling, movies, TVs, books. Also a huge fan. So
Indeed, yeah. Eli, don't worry. Eli and I have got a potential book podcast series in the works as far as discussing some fantasy series that may or may not be getting adapted into movies and TV show form.
Dungeon Crawler Carl. I'll get more news about that lately.
Dungeon Crawler Carl. Again, I'm telling you, Eli, we're gonna get that Malazan adaptation off the ground, even if it kills us, and quite literally kills us. For sure. Oh man, you guys can follow me with everything going on at Movie Nerd Reviews across all platforms, at Official Talk TV Podcast across all platforms. Be sure to check out mine and Luke's continued recaps of Talking Lost. We are almost done with season 5. We are officially in the end game for that show as well. And be sure to check out our slew of movie reviews. We're taking a little bit of a break. We've got Spider-Man coming out this weekend, but then after that, we're taking a little bit of a break for the month of August before we come back in full force in September in order to go us through the rest of the year. Pat will be back on some movie reviews. I'm going to try and get Eli on some movie reviews. I'm always here. I'm always here podcasting about different various and assorted stuff. And as always, people, 12 seasons in a short film. And watch more fucking movies. And in this case, more dragons. We'll see you guys next week for the penultimate episode, House of the Dragon, Season 3. Take care.